Just in time.
चेक अभिषेक हेलो चेक 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 चेक
Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to the School of Liberal Studies at BML Munjal University. We are thrilled to have you join us today for the launch of our public policy series, designed to foster thoughtful discussions on pressing issues of our time. Today's inaugural talk, titled "Is Consumption a Black Box in Public Policy?" will delve into how consumerism and neoliberal values shape public policy and affect key areas such as sustainability, inequality, and well-being in India. This conversation seeks to illuminate the often overlooked role of consumption in sustainable development and calls for a critical shift in our policy and societal values. This paper has developed from the discussion paper series anchored by Professor Ashwini Seth, Dean Emeritus, School of Liberal Studies, and Dr. Idris Kant. The discussion paper series in turn has emerged from the Faculty Research Colloquium at SOLS, which is led by Professor Ashwini Seth and Dr. Suchismita Chattopadhyay. Our panel today will include some of the most distinguished voices in this area. We have with us Professor Chiranjib Sen. Professor Sen is at BMU. He has taught at several institutions across the world and is the founding chairperson of the Center for Public Policy at IIM Bangalore. He has dedicated his career to exploring the intersections of economic policy, public welfare, and governance. Professor Sen will open with remarks on why consumption deserves a place in public policy discussions, drawing from his deep expertise in this field. Next, we have with us Professor Asim Srivastav. A writer, teacher, and ecological thinker, Professor Srivastav holds a doctorate in economics from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. He has taught extensively in India and the US, most recently in philosophy at Nordic College, Norway. His work critically explores global development models and their impacts on sustainability, social justice, and well-being. Professor Srivastav is also the co-author of Churning the Earth, The Making of Global India with Ashish Kothari. We are also joined by Professor Shray Das Gupta, a professor at the Center for the Study of Law and Governance at JNU. Dr. Das Gupta's research focuses on the political economy of institutions and accumulation, particularly regarding caste, class, and gender. Her work examines how law intersects with economic policy, covering areas such as corporate governance and public finance. Her acclaimed book, State and Capital in Independent India, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2016. Finally, we have with us Professor Anup Dhar. Professor Dhar is a distinguished visiting professor at SOLS BMU and a fellow at the Hans Killian and Lotte Kohler Center, Ruhr University, Bochum, Germany. Trained in medicine, psychology, and philosophy, he has authored numerous works that examine the intersections of psychoanalysis, philosophy, and practical ethics. He's currently working on a book about Girendra Sekhar Bose and explores complex issues in socio-cultural and economic contexts. Our moderator for this session is Dr. Somajit Bhar, Assistant Dean of Admissions and Outreach and a founding faculty member at SOLS BMU. Dr. Bhar has over 15 years of experience in addressing environmental and sustainability issues. His research examines the socio-psychological drivers of conspicuous consumption and its environmental impacts. I welcome you all. To begin with, we will hear from Professor Arindam Banerjee, our Dean of the School of Liberal Studies, who will introduce the public policy program at SOLS and frame some guiding questions for today's discussion. I invite you, Professor Banerjee.
Thanks, Vaishali. We do not yet have a public policy program, but we intend to, and there's certain rounds of brainstorming that has been going on around the questions of public policy. And my job today is, of course, to set the context for this particular panel discussion, but also kind of what the thoughts are in terms of how we imagine public policy today. Since we are starting a little late, I'll keep it slightly shorter. My job is largely to not really answer any questions, but actually throw certain questions, to the panel, but to the larger audience. So, of course, we know that public policy itself has a long history, and any society that is not based on self-governance needs some kind of policy to be framed. Where there's a division between a class of rulers and a large section of population who are ruled, the question of policy comes in. Public policy as an area, of course, assumes a certain particular importance over the last 3.5 decades or so, if I may say so, not only in India but across the world, across the developing world, particularly in the context of globalization, liberalization, where it was thought that countries are now going to embark on a new trajectory of policies, and there's a professional requirement of having a set of public policy experts, if I may also, who think about policies. We get new terms during this time, stakeholder consultations, which were not heard of, say, in the 70s or the 80s. So there was that idea, there was that anxiety that the new trajectory itself might leave out certain section of populations or may not be able to capture their aspirations adequately, and therefore, if we are framing policies, we actually need a larger ecosystem, which we call as the ecosystem of public policy. Now, with those, of course, this doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's not a question which is, it's not a concept which is thrown there without its contexts. With public policy, or public policy as it has emerged over the last 3.5 decades, since the 80s or the 90s in the last century, there are certain other concepts which are associated with it. The primary one is the question of development. And development itself, not a uncontested term, as some of the panelists would surely touch upon today, along with policy targets and strategies to achieve that development. So policy making itself kind of gets, if I may say, a central motivation, a central direction towards which different sections of the, different sectors of the economy and different sections of the society are supposed to kind of work towards. What has been, so development policy targets, policy strategies itself has been quite integral in that sense. And what has been the overall impact, now that we look at this in hindsight, to put it very mildly, we can say that we have not really got a very satisfactory outcome as we stand today in the world today, in the contemporary world with all its contemporary challenges. To put it maybe a little honestly, it has often been a disaster. And sometimes it's, it's the privilege of the expert which guides us through this policy realm. And often what I call is sometimes the tyranny of numbers, which tell us where we are going or where we are not going. Just share, as an example of this, is that we smoothly transitioned, from the Millennium Development Goals to the Sustainable Development Goals. The Millennium Development Goals, which were supposed to kind of were to be achieved by 2015, one doesn't really know whether there was a frank assessment of whether we achieved the Millennium Development Goals before we placed for ourselves a new set of goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, and of course we are working towards that. For some of us who were scholars who were interested in food policy, hunger, and used to track regularly the Millennium Development Goal 1, which is that the hunger should be halved by 2015, both in terms of proportion and absolute, compared to a base year of 1992, if I remember correctly. And of course, the global financial crisis happened, and we used to look at the state of food insecurity in the world that the Food and Agriculture Organization regularly annually publishes. And we were, of course, getting a very despondent picture of what is happening, that we are not only not moving towards the target, we are actually moving away from it, both in proportion of hungry people as well as in terms of absolute numbers. And then the 2015 report comes out, which is the year when the MDG should be kind of achieved. And to our surprise, we see that we have nearly achieved it. What happened suddenly? We are moving away from the targets and then we nearly achieve it. And of course, many people wrote that, see, it's not really, it's largely the East Asian phenomenon which is showing the progress. The other regions have not really gained much. But most importantly, you find that there's an annexure in the report, which tells us, even if we say that the East Asian progress was notable, the numbers were still not matching compared to what FAO itself was publishing over the previous few years. And we find that they have an annexure which says there are two changes in our methodology. One is, of course, we are not capturing nutrition intakes properly, and we have upgraded our model. Rest of it is, of course, explained in some technical paper and some metadata, which again experts can only analyze. But the most important point that was there in the annexure was that, look, we had a problem with the numbers right at the beginning. Our 1990 Chinese population numbers were not correct. And now we have revised them. They were actually much higher than what we had estimated, and therefore the hunger in China was also much higher than what we had estimated. So today we have achieved the target compared. So you basically changed things for the base year. Nobody asked a question about how can an organization like FAO work with wrong population figures for 23 years before discovering suddenly, just when you have to achieve the goal, that no, we were working with the wrong figure. So, a lot of things gets clouded. This is an example that I gave primarily to say that, when we think of public policy, we think of a lot of evidence, data, we say evidence-based policy. But do we interrogate the evidence? Do we interrogate the numbers? Is it possible always for the common public to interrogate the numbers, because there are layers and layers of metadata that gets that is there behind these numbers? To come to the context and to come to the main questions that I wanted to put before the panel and the larger audience, I mean, we all recognize that today we have a situation where there are certain challenges which are almost akin to civilizational challenges, whether it be the question of climate crisis, the question of inequality, wealth inequality, inequality in living standards, the very paradox that we continuously have high GDP growth rates. Our GDPs are increasing, but what is happening to our well-being? What is happening to our, as many are raising now, what is happening to happiness in general? Poor learning outcomes in our educational system. We, of course, continuously try to expand, bring more and more people under the ambit of education. But what is also at the same time happening to our educational system? Is there a self-reflection there? And of course, with COVID pandemic, I don't need to underscore the question of rising health risks that we are living with. The global financial crisis as well as the pandemic, in my opinion, however, gives us an opportunity to reopen some of the paradigms, rethink some of the paradigms in which public policy has been kind of practiced as an enterprise in a very professional manner. And two questions I kind of raise it. One, of course, the question of who makes public policy and for whom, the question of agency, the question of privilege. Of course, there's governments, think tanks, civil society organizations, businesses, professional consulting firms. There's a whole range of institutions which are engaged in public policy, including ourselves like in university. But the important question that needs to be dealt upon is that when we are making policy for so-called others, we are making policy for a population. And of course, even with stakeholder consultations, we know that we cannot capture everybody's opinion. Consultations itself have their own power hierarchies. So where does the privilege lie? The privilege of knowledge and agency, which sets the agenda for public policy, which sets the agenda for development. We need to ask the question that is there knowledge lying within the society and communities which also needs to be preserved, and not always new knowledge which needs to be privileged upon. Have we actually ignored that? Have we not preserved that? Have we tampered with that knowledge that already was there, and which is what is responsible for the juncture at which we are today, is a question that also needs to be asked. We talk about a knowledge economy, which is of course using knowledge legitimately so for improving one's own, not only one's own understanding but also one's own position within the society. The whole question of upward mobility, the aspirations that are there. But can we also think of moving from a knowledge economy to a knowledge society, where we also preserve the knowledge that is there within the society? So that is the first question that I kind of want to place. And the second question, of course, is the ambit of public policy. What comes in public policy and what doesn't come? And that actually links with today's panel discussion, I think, in a more integral manner. Does human behavior come under public policy, or is it something that's placed in a public space, private space? That is something that we should not go there. Of course, for many of the problems, we understand that these are structural problems and they need structural solutions. It's not possible for single individuals to kind of change this. But are structural solutions also possible without change in the way we live, in the way we consume, in the way we deal with the questions of sustainability in our daily lives? So the question of human values, ethics, empathy, solidarity are probably aspects which public policy actually needs to engage with. So I end with the questions that can the public policy professional also be self-aware and empathetic? If yes, how? We don't know how. Or do we need barefoot policy churners instead of public policy professionals? Is also a question that I would like to throw open. And finally, is public policy in the current context, can it sustain itself necessarily as an anthropocentric enterprise? Or can nature have a voice also in public policy? So I won't delay the panel discussion further. I'll leave us with these questions. And of course, without necessarily seeking an answer from the panel today, but these are larger questions that we intend to kind of delve in when we are imagining our program in public policy at BMU School of Liberal Studies. So thank you. And look forward to an exciting panel discussion.
Thank you, Professor Banerjee, for setting the ground. Without further ado, I would like to hand it over to Shomajit, who will lead us through the discussion.
Thank you, Vaishali. Before I hand over to Professor Sen, I just want to add, I think Arindam has already laid out the ground and put quite a few questions. I'll just add one more question and I'll just hand it over to Professor Sen for further deliberation, and I will also share the structure of the panel. So one of the things that what Arindam also indicated is that public policy presumes industrial mode of development, and that industrial mode of development uh, presupposes certain use of fossil fuel based infrastructure to problematize the amount of human labor that is necessary and the amount of time that is usually required when we do things in a non-fossil fuel led infrastructural sense. And what it happens is that it necessarily promotes an individualization that is premised on having that material infrastructure, and that individualization is kind of antithetical to the whole idea of the public, which the public policy in turn tries to kind of preserve or whatever, at least think about. So I see that there is a fundamental contradiction in the way public policy presupposes a mode of development and move to work and the way it eventually plays out. So with that, I think in this whole process, consumption, consumerism, consumer values is the central the node which kind of drives this whole change. So I would like also to see if panel can touch upon this issue as we go into the discussion. So before I hand over to Professor Sen, the panel structure would be Professor Sen would firstly talk about the discussion paper that Vaishali mentioned, and he will also highlight some of the points that are relevant to this today's discussion. And then we will move to Professor Shray Das Gupta for her comments, and then Professor Asim Srivastav, and then to Professor Anubdhar. In between, if there are some questions that might provoke the more discussions, I will place them. So over to you, Professor Sen.
Yes. Thank you, Shomajit, and thank you, Vaishali, and thanks to all of you for coming here today. Please tell me when I've got about 5 minutes left. I'll be brief, but the basic theme of today's discussion is about consumption. And what I want to say is that this is an area that has been relatively neglected in policymaking. We've sort of taken it for granted, and I want to challenge this particular approach. So I'm basically arguing in this paper that we need a conscious strategy to deal with the issue of consumption. And I'll basically give a few points which are contained in my paper. I won't have time to get into them, but you can know the flow of my argument. Basically, what's going on right now is that we are in a psychological climate of consumerism, and that is, basically means that we should maximize the growth rate, and all economic policy is focused on that. And if you maximize the national growth, national income, the idea is that people will then be able to increase their consumption. And if you maximize income, the basic thinking is that if you maximize income, consumption will take care of itself. We don't need to think about either the content or the quantity, any of these things. So this is what is being meant by the idea that consumption is a black box. And what is really the case right now is that I think that the time has come to look into it. Economic theory says, of course, nothing should be done. And if there is any problem, like the pollution or something, then they have a kind of a set of procedures which is basically incentive oriented, individual incentives to correct what is called externalities. But I'm going to argue that that's really not enough. And so what I wanted to say is that we need to go beyond this idea that through incentives you can manage any kind of thing that may go wrong in consumption, quantity or composition. Why do we want to say that? Why am I saying this? What's wrong with maximizing consumption? Here, the basic idea is, underlying this whole justification of this attitude is that consumption and happiness or well-being are almost synonymous in the present ideological framework. People don't question it at all. But that is not true. And so if you want to really open up the black box, the first question you want to ask is, what's wrong with consumption? And here, of course, this has been mentioned many times, there are two issues very broadly that can no longer be evaded. One is the issue of sustainability, simply coming against planetary boundaries, and therefore we can't let things go on as they are. And the second question that is relatively less interrogated, especially in economic policy making, is the idea that consumption and happiness are synonymous. And I want to argue that it is not. Not me alone, there is a whole body of psychological literature which is generally neglected in economic policy discussions, which I want to argue should be brought into the centerpiece of thinking. And so what to do? Basically, the argument is that we must moderate consumption and restructure consumption. My paper argues that. But we must separate out the rich from the poor and have a bifurcated policy. And today's discussion is focusing on the richer sections. For the poor, in my paper, you'll see there are a different approach, and the approach simply is to retain, do whatever is necessary by policy to maintain what is called decent standard of living. And that can be quantified, and people like Shomujit have done calculations like exactly what's needed to be done. So I won't go into that. But I want to talk about the rich, because here the idea is that my argument would be change their value system. Don't try to moderate their behavior by controls, by bans, and by incentives, tax and subsidy. Change the way they think. And that's a very big question and not usually part of economic discussions at all. What am I talking about? How can it be done? How can we promote voluntary adaptation of consumption? I'm arguing that it can be done via persuasion and education as some of the main instruments. And through that, we want to change values and attitudes. The approach that is there in the paper is that there are kind of two-pronged approach. One is to appeal to people's deeper sense of logic. So you increase the scope for genuinely rational discussions by giving more information for better decision making, etc., and make better opportunities. So that's the logical mode of intervention. The other is from the emotional side, that is change their norms and attitudes currently away from the two big pillars, that is individualism and materialism. The value system is grounded on these two, and these have to be questions, interrogated. But in order to make the micro attitude work, micro policies work, it actually requires a bigger change in the macro policy environment. You need an enabling macroeconomic and policy approach that foregrounds human development, is my argument. But I don't have time to get into that, this macro issue. I'm going to assume that it is getting done because that's really a very big political question. You need to change the policy-making style and the implementation institutions also. So I'm going to focus really on the micro part of the discussion, of the points that I made. Now, how to crack open the consumption? What's wrong? Well, first, if we assume that the people's consumption attitude, consumerist mindset is driven by deep values, what are they? Individualism, greed I mean non-satiation, you're never satisfied. Whatever you have, you want more. And materialism, that everything is linked to material accumulation, possessions, etc. You really think that this is how happiness will come. This particular thing, now we have lots of research going on in rich countries over a long period of time, and they found that this is not really, we are not really bringing about well-being. So there is a crack between well-being and consumption from psychological research. What's wrong? What happens is that these societies at the individual level, if you look at rich countries, many studies have come, they say that these value systems are causing fear, anxiety, stress at the individual level. And you also have observed issues like rise of clinical depression, you have alcoholism, you have drug addiction and crime, and these have been going on for decades now. At the time when these currently rich countries were actually increasing their income. So there is, people have been noticing that there is a problem there, but somehow we're going along. But the time has come that we cannot take it anymore for granted. So what's behind it? There are values. And the first question, of course, comes, well, values is that people are like that. People, they want to eat, they want to, etc. I want to say that's not true. There's enough argument, data to suggest that values are malleable. They change differently. They change slowly, but they can be changed. And indeed, we need to change the values through policy interventions, but not in the way that governments typically do it. In fact, I want to argue that the governments only should take an enabling attitude and don't enter into value changing directly. But that's a different matter. I don't want to get into the details, but there is studies have been carried out at least since the 1970s, if not earlier, systematically, which are called happiness surveys or self-reported life satisfaction surveys of households, very carefully done. And this has been done in different countries, including Japan, United States, and China, where per capita incomes have been rising. Real per capita incomes have been rising quite a bit. And they've done these surveys by a very similar thing. Categories, are you very happy, reasonably happy, not very happy, or other? And people say what they are. That's their life satisfaction indicators. And we find the data very striking, that in all of these countries, despite the fact that in some cases per capita income has increased in this, let me two decades by 5 times, or 2 or 3 decades in which the data has been collected, the proportion of happy people is not rising. And in a country like China, in fact, it's come down. So that those data exist, and we should take note of them. Increase in proportion, China income in this period rose 2.5 times, in Japan 5 times, etc. Everywhere, proportion of happy or very happy people have not gone up. In fact, some places gone down. On the other hand, within the society, what happens is richer people are happier. So you can see that there is a cross-section impact of money, income, but not average happiness. So we can get into the details of what's going on, but that is an issue. That look, there is data to suggest that this is not something wrong. Income doesn't bring you happiness. And I don't want to get into the details. There are so many experts here, but just to mention that undeniable evidence now of the climate sustainability issue. And I'm with great experts here. I won't get into it, but you know what they're saying. And you see it every day. Even today's TV, you saw the big foam on the Jamuna. So we have wildfires, hurricanes, deforestation, floods, high temperatures, droughts, and along with them new diseases, new viruses. I mean, COVID, etc. is probably a creation of these things, many others. So this is a real serious issue that can no longer be neglected. And the other thing is that India is actually one of the most affected countries according to several studies. The Climate Transparency Report of 2022 said that, I don't know the methodology exactly how it was, but they give a number like 5.4% of GDP in India, according to them, was lost due to extreme heat, loss of labor hours, and declining productivity. And 5.4% is not a joke for 1 year. When the average growth rate in the 5-year period, was about 4.5 in that, from 1917 to 2022. So it's a high number. The other thing is that World Meteorological Association, they have said that that we are witnessing a doubling of the rate of increase of sea levels, average sea levels. We know what's going on, the melting of the glaciers, and Iceland and Greenland and etc. I don't want to get into the detail. You know the story, but it needs to be noted. And the past 8 years, on 10 years, have been the warmest on record. Every year is more warm than the previous. Now, India is ranked the 3rd most endangered country among 50 countries surveyed, vulnerable to climate disasters. It is the 4th highest in regard to climate migration internally, which also I did not know before. And 21 of the 30 most polluted cities are in India. So India cannot simply say, look, we are not affected. But don't you notice that in spite of all this evidence and all that, the policy response is almost zero, almost. I mean, people talk about it, but in terms of effective intervention, it's so little. So something's got to change. And clearly, as Arindam was saying, we are witnessing these things on a regular basis, but our capacity to respond, something is wrong with the systems of how we respond to problems. If people are feeling the problems but they can't do anything, the response is going in other directions. Not the way it should be. Some kind of political positions are taken. Blame X, blame Y. All right. So that's the basic reason for what I'm saying. Now, if you want to do research on this and ask what's going on, I don't want to take too much time, but I wanted to simply say, look here, we know what the standard thinking is. Standard thinking says, I'm coming back to consumption. I'll cut it short because I'm running out of time. But basically, I wanted to say is that the current I've told you what the current thinking is about income and happiness reaction. But what we need to do is to recognize the following, which is not generally openly admitted in policy making. First of all, we take tastes as given. When we talk about people making, tastes are given, but in fact, tastes are not given. And we must take note of that. Why is it not given? Because it's been changing all the time through vast expenditures in advertising and business persuasion. Secondly, there is a whole neoliberal economic ideology that is pushing this whole behavior. So it's not given, number one. Secondly, what makes people happy? It's not consumption. There are two different mediating factors between consumption and well-being. One mediating factor is social determinant, and the other mediating factor is psychological determinant. The social determinant, studies have shown, is that people have what is called rank happiness. They consume because they want to be higher than others, keeping up with the Joneses, they're up to the peer group. So they're really consuming because they feel that material consumption will up their status. They're fighting for status through material accumulation. That's not accumulation. That's not consumption. That's something different. So that's a social determinant which we don't really take note of seriously. People are aware of it. The other part is the psychological determinant. That's also lots of studies, is that there is something called what is called the hedonic treadmill, which is to say that people get accustomed to whatever standard of living, no matter how high it is, they get bored after a while. And so they want novelty. And you can't have the same level of income and stay at the same level of happiness. So you keep on struggling, and you think that happiness can be attained by more materialism. So we are caught in a kind of hedonic, addictive consumption trap. So either we are doing competitive consumption, social determinant, or we are doing this hedonic consumption to prevent ourselves from getting bored and in search of novelty. So that's the problem. And then of course the other question is, let me cut it short here. Doesn't matter, let me move on. The next question I want to address is that let's unpack what well-being is. What is well-being? What is this happiness? Now here also economic and social research is now accepting the fact that there are two types, independent types and categories of happiness. One is called hedonic well-being, and the other is a term attributed to Aristotle called eudaimonic happiness. It's a Greek word, I suppose, but essentially hedonic well-being is consumption. You feel good, you have materialistic values, and that pushes hedonic consumption, and we've seen that doesn't make you very happy. The eudaimonic happiness is actually not material at all. It is about functioning well. It's very similar to Amartya Sen and Nussbaum's idea. It's a parallel. So you flourish well across multiple domains of life. Deeper sources of satisfaction and it's an ethical bound. That's the supposedly higher level and true level of happiness. And I want to get into details here, but it's very easy to understand that this philosophy is extremely parallel with Vedantic philosophy and Buddhist philosophy. Because what is being said is happiness is within you. You must reach that, and once you reach that, you can act from a position of composure, not in a kind of victimized, dependent mode. So, what are the characteristics? Let me not get into details, but essentially, it's the attainment of inner composure. And my hypothesis, and I don't know if anybody else has made this hypothesis openly, I see some evidence that it is true. My hypothesis is that they are not independent. If you attain eudaimonic happiness, I am saying that you will get control over hedonic tendencies. In other words, people will consume better if you can create a society in which you can attain eudaimonic happiness, inner happiness. So basically, that's my basic point, and I'm running out of time. So let me just, before I end, I wanted to, I've got many come up in the discussion, but you asked the question, how can we change? What can we do? Yes, it's fine, eudaimonic happiness. So I have basically argued in that paper that there are two things you can do. One is to change values and norms, to change the background, the values which are the basis of our decisions, that can be changed. And I've argued that can be changed through education. But the government can play a particular role in supporting change. And they can partner. And to illustrate what I mean, I've done a case study in this paper that is circulated of one good example, at least one good example. There are many, could be many, of a higher education example of a program, of a course that is now almost run 20 years, which I've had the good fortune to go and actually observe them in IIIT Hyderabad. That is the International Institute for Information Technology Hyderabad, which is a compulsory course on human values education. The details are there. The pedagogy is very different, but it tries to enable people, the students over there, to overcome their stress and anxiety and dependency, and basically be able to make choices from a position of inner stability and discernment. It can be done. One can experiment, and certainly this thing can be done in school elsewhere. It is a rational, humanistic, universalist approach. Comes very close to spiritual values without necessarily belonging to any particular religion. So that's one way of intervening if you wanted to change the values. The second thing I mentioned is that let me get into how values can change. Well, values can change according to there are some behavior change professionals, psychologists, who have mentioned that values can change through personal experiences, through peer pressures, through parents' example, through leaders, through teachers and media, and through workplace socialization, where identities are created and common perspectives on the world are built. And very important are group activities, discussion, and mutual motivation. So these are the pedagogies that enable you to move towards changing norms and values. Now, second point, and I'll end with this, is that these are the value changing is the big thing. It will take time, values will change, people will go out of college, etc. But are there any more things that can be done? Yes, you can actually do something to change the way people make choices for consumption. Very practical. And what it is, and this is again, I don't see anybody else applying it to anybody. I'm saying, apply what is called the social marketing approach to changing consumption behavior. Particularly, let's say, environmental adaptation. What is social marketing? It is a field that has grown since the mid-1970s. Kotler is a very famous marketing person who developed this approach. Others have followed up. Social marketing, simply speaking, is applying business management techniques to bringing about different social values and social decisions, social choices. So you can adapt it. And I've recommended that that can be done. Because even if you go broadcasting all over the place, writing articles and talking about how bad this environmental damage is, this is happening, that is happening, people won't change. Because that is not enough. In order to make a real difference, you have got to have an institutional intervention. For that, you need a systematic strategy and adaptation. It can be done at the micro level in millions and millions of different experiments. What is it? With this I'll stop. It's a two-way process of communication. That is what marketing is, not one-sided. And you have to, actually study the target group, segment them, develop strategies to change their behavior. You must assess the intensity of their motivation to change and persuade them through communication strategy. You must provide knowledge of how and where an individual can fulfill the motivation. They've been changed by a persuasion, but how will they act? If they don't know what to do, it won't work. In fact, it will backfire. You must ensure a mechanism for action for motivation. That has to be done. Once you persuade them, and also make sure that an individual's personal cost, perceived cost, not only physical cost, monetary cost, psychological cost. For example, in a hospital, suppose, you may think it's free hospital, but if people treat you badly, insult you, if you're a poor person, you won't go there because the psychological cost is too high. So, in other words, you have to assess the cost involved and make sure that it's commensurate with the benefit that comes from making a particular change. So for this, to do all this, you can't leave it to the sky. You need a planning and implementation system to do it. And I found by chance a rather good example of it. And in my paper, I've discussed briefly. This is a program, very practical, how to get people in Delhi. It's called the Solarize Delhi campaign in two wealthy neighborhood, upper middle class neighborhoods. They did a pilot study by this organization CEEW, Center, what is it, not center, it's called conference, whatever, Council on Energy, Environment and Water. They are the implementers. They have got a thing of how to persuade people to install rooftop solar equipment, photovoltaic equipment, how to make them do it. Because they found out by studies, it's the businesses that are doing it, but residential response throughout India has been very bad. So this is an example. This example is actually copied from America, and I don't want to get into the details. It has happened out of a top-down thing in the sense that the government of India and the government of the United States, they struck a agreement. But long and short of it, what they have done is that it's a public-private partnership in which this EEW is the implementing agency backed by the government, and there are partnerships with two power distribution companies, the BSES, BYPL and BRPL in Delhi, and two South Delhi neighborhood associations. So these are the people that did it. And just to finish now, last point. No, it's over. What they've done in Solarize Delhi is they have a bunch of promotion activities. They have some communication channels, and they have what they are and how they go about it. There is a discussion I can talk about what they have done, but it is possible. It is something that has to be planned. There has to be an implementation framework, but it can be done consciously by a proper, for example, here website, etc. Okay. Sorry, but I'm sorry if I've taken a little too long. Right. Thank you. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, I'm very grateful to the organizers, especially in the School of Liberal Studies at Munjal University, for thinking of me as to be part of this panel. I'm really not an expert on public policy. It's very far from what I do. but I do have a critique of public policy, and possibly that's the reason I've been included here. So I hope I'll live up to the expectation with which Arindam must have suggested my name. Okay, so my departure and entry point into this discussion that has been framed by Professor Sen is to raise one question which relates to what Arindam had also raised, but which Professor Sen has also addressed in a certain way, which is what kind of agency is really the question. And can a world, so I frame it in a different way, this question that has been framed today. So I frame it a little differently to ask, can a world of consumption reliant on commercial advertising and branding and giant structures of oligopolistic production for consumption be trusted to be socially responsive to campaigns, mediation, education, and sensitive to ecological destruction and inequality? And in doing so, I go back to the history of thought to re-engage with the concept of the metabolic rift in ecology. John Bellamy Foster shows that the work of a range of 19th century thinkers across disciplines, across the natural and social sciences, culminated in Marx's formulation that agriculture, industry, and commerce together create the metabolic rift in the relationship between human beings and nature. So it's not just ecology or the question of consumption, but it needs to be framed in terms of the relationship between human beings and nature. And in fact, to quote Foster, the celebrated unity of human beings with nature, Marx argued, had always existed in industry, and so had the struggle of humans with nature. The two things go together, and one cannot deny either this reality of unity nor the reality of struggle in human relations to nature. So Marx argued that one needs to look at the sensuous world, okay, as consisting of the total living sensuous activity of those living in it. Okay. From this standpoint, human beings make their own environments, but not under conditions entirely of their choosing. Many of you are familiar with this, but rather based on conditions handed down from the earth and from earlier generations in the course of history, both natural and human. In analyzing the metabolic rift, 19th century thinkers like Lippig, a natural scientist, and Marx and Engels did not stop with the soil-nutrient cycle or the town-country relations, rural-urban as we know today. They addressed at various points in their work such issues as deforestation, desertification, climate change, the elimination of species from the forests, the commodification of species, pollution, industrial waste, toxic contamination, recycling, the exhaustion of coal mines, diseases, overcrowding, and unhealthy housing conditions, and the evolution and co-evolution of species, and this relates very much to what is considered to be a neoliberal problem, which seems to have been the concern of the debates in the 19th century, almost in the same way as we seem to be anxious about these today. So my entry point is to ask, what purpose does consumption serve in a capitalist society? Capitalism runs on greed, the motive that drives profit making. It is the nature and logic of capital that runs on mass production of industrially produced commodities, that has the tendency to cheapen all commodities, as well as that unique commodity called labor or labor power, as you like it, if you depending on which side of the debate in between the classicals and Marx you stand. But it also produces and constructs needs, what Marx famously wrote in 1867, not just of the stomach but of fancy. So capitalism creates fancy, capitalism creates needs, capitalism creates the urge for consumption. Simultaneously, it also shapes social relations and values by reducing the social relations between human beings and that of human beings and nature to relationship between things, which is the sine qua non of alienation. These processes play out through institutional structures, and there I agree with Professor Sen, but we look at institutions differently. The contemporary institutions evolved through history in the form of giant oligopolistic corporations, and the nation state are the purveyors of these processes. However, capitalism also uses social structures of power based on race, caste, religion, and patriarchy, not necessarily in that order, to co-constitute social relations of class within which markets and institutional spheres of finance, credit, and trade are embedded. These institutions together create subjective conditions on one hand, property and capital ownership, from which we have the notion of the private, and it is within capitalist thinking then the only opposite is the public. So there is this binary of the private and the public, and there is no space to think of any other forms of ownership or even like imagination. So this duality of ownership and non-ownership thus produces immense wealth and immense poverty and inequality together. So the 58% of aggregate demand in India that Professor Sen's paper starts with, that comes from household consumption in India, is embedded in this structure. And thus the differential patterns of consumption, which Professor Sen also acknowledges, cannot be comprehended without delving into this institutional structure, in my opinion. In India in 1989, 65%, and this is ASI data, calculations that I made from Annual Survey of Industries data, in 1989, 65% of total value produced went to workers as wages, and 35% was the surplus, from which a portion accrued as profit apart from rent, interest, and other deductions. Today, just 35% goes to workers and 65% accrues as surplus. Okay? In 1989, for every 10 rupees produced as value, so if this cost 10 rupees in 1989, 65 paisa used to go to labor as wages. Today, if this costs... No. For every 10 rupees, 65 paisa goes to wages. Okay, 6.5 out of 100. Yeah, that's the shocking part. It's unbelievable, but you can check, like it's publicly available data. Today, if this costs 10 rupees, 23 paise goes to labor. Okay, so thus India's development trajectory and its integration into the global economy has been based on labor cheapening. With no regulation of monopoly and an institutional structure of accumulation described earlier, there is evidence of consumption squeeze in real terms, quite opposed to what is being described for the upper middle classes and the rich among the working class. Archana Agarwal of Hindu College has shown through her meticulous work a system of reverse remittances where factory workers in Delhi NCR, contrary and in fact very close to the university where many of you are housed, to sending money home, depend on subsistence supplies from home for survival. So food grain comes from home because they can't afford to buy it from the market, okay, the year round. I have found similar evidence among domestic workers and care workers in Delhi NCR. The dismantling of an universal and effective public distribution system and withdrawal of food and fuel subsidies show these changes in pattern of consumption of the working poor. Official poverty estimates fail to take account of these processes. Moreover, the wage depression and labor cheapening process in India has increased the burden of unpaid work in social reproduction, not to just maintain the labor force, but also maintain profit rates of capital in India, which is also something that's not discussed much, which has systematically fallen since liberalization, despite absolute profits increasing. From about 27% in 1989, it fell to 12% by 2016-17, and it has shown a slightly upward trend in recent years. But once again, the processes through which that has happened is also something to be questioned. On the other hand, direct taxation rates in India have become hugely perverse since the 1990s. Effective, that is, actual rates of taxation of corporate incomes and individual incomes have fallen drastically for big corporations. They only pay 20 to 23% tax in India. Rich individuals pay 9 to 10% tax on their income, and the Hindu undivided families pay just 8% effective tax on their income. Further, empirical work, including mine, shows GST, which is supposed to be a tax on consumption and is yet another way of addressing consumption, has led to increase of the indirect tax burden on the poor, on women, the elderly, the sick, and the disabled. So just one example, medicine and healthcare. Earlier, with the unaffordability of medicine and treatment, the poor took recourse to traditional or alternative medicine systems. Today, with the huge capitalist oligopolies dominating traditional medicine and healthcare, the very consumption of lifestyle statements of the rich, when you choose alternative lifestyles, has made both modern and alternative medicine systems out of bounds for the poor, pushing them out. So the consumption of the rich and the consumption of the poor cannot be discussed in isolation, need to be discussed together. On a different but related register, Sainath and others have shown that death by suicide among the poor and marginal farmers, and especially women, go undocumented in India. Their evidence shows rise in both institutional and non-institutional debt for funding essential consumption as well as production as one of the causes of extreme mental stress and mental health crisis. My work with Pradhan on SHGs in Jharkhand, which we did recently, and Pranav here was a part of it, corroborates this increase in death stress on especially tribal and Dalit women. We need to move away from affluent ideas of stress, lifestyle, well-being to, I think, address the following question: whether consumption can at all be curtailed in the interest of ecology under capitalism, and especially in India, given our social structures of accumulation, inequality, and alienation, through appeals only to civilizational values, whether Indian or otherwise. This is a question I would like to bring to the table and request the focus of the debate to include the possibility of universal provisioning of universal needs, which should be free at the point of delivery: food and nutrition, health and healthcare, education, housing, public transport, and sanitation. This can lead to elimination of identification errors and also would create a floor beyond which labor cheapening and consumption squeeze of the poor cannot be used as a tool of wealth and capital accumulation and, by extension, hedonic consumption or luxury consumption. This would also generate jobs of high quality and also ensure quality of the universal services, with the middle class as a major stakeholder, as the experience of many of the European countries where they are now, of course, dismantling these systems show, especially the Nordic countries. The person who's experienced about Nordic countries has left the room, so I don't know whether I'm right. But whatever little I know about the Northern European countries shows that this is it has, at least for a longer period than most experiments, shown that it is sustainable in both reducing poverty and inequality and preserving a certain level of ecological systems to the extent possible within the nation state in a capitalist society. So two things follow from this proposition: restriction, curtailment, abolition of monopoly and oligopoly, is it possible? And a genuinely progressive taxation system, is it possible? That would ensure that provisioning can be free at the point of delivery. Nothing is free, but it can be free at the point of delivery without any compromise on quality. So let me end with a few questions rather than answers. Who would be opposed to this and who would support this? what are the material ideological grounds of opposition and support? Is it capital's value system and logic, or human sensuousness free of the influence of capital that constitutes both support and opposition? Why were universal systems derided and destroyed where those existed and never considered as an option, for example in India, in public policy? Okay? What kind of a nation state can have that relative autonomy to even consider these as viable options? And can any such support galvanize in the direction for creation of a society of associated, because you cannot consume unless something is produced, okay? So associated producers and consumers that ensures both preservation of nature and elimination of alienation and inequality. Thank you.
Is the volume okay? Am I audible at the back? Yeah. Thank you to Shomajit, Arindam, School of Liberal Studies, and all you students for coming all the way from Munjal. I know how far it is from here. I was there the other day. Dr. Das Gupta has actually made my task considerably easier by laying out a very rich historical background to what is falsely described as neoliberalism. It's neither new nor liberal. It's corporate totalitarianism, as I understand it. That's what I call it in our book, the only book which I've written, Churning the Earth. And that background is necessary to understand and appreciate why the tail cannot actually wag the dog. And let me explain my metaphor now. I have not read every word of Dr. Sen's paper, which is excellent, but I have got a good sense of the general flow of argument, and after listening to him this afternoon, I want to pose the following question. What if the policy that you're describing succeeds? Let's work through those steps and let's see where it gets us. In other words, answering Arindam's question, is consumption a matter of public policy or not, which is a pre-question to this. Let's not forget that we were ruled by a company for over a century, right? And which actually completely makes nonsense of the distinction between private and public, so dear to liberal Britain and the West. It means nothing in the colonies, right? The interests of a company and the interests of the country or the Raj unified within the body politic of the Raj, right? We saw that for over 100 years. Let us not forget that, nor are we allowed the right to be complacent about the fact that this is an irreversible process, that we are living in a post-colonial era. On the contrary, if I had time, I would try to show you with some data on my side that colonialism is at its very apogee, the very envy of Clive and Hastings. This much transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich has not happened in history, not since Alexander and Caesar. But leave that on the side right now. Let's work through the idea that consumption is an object of public policy, should be, and let's work through the proposal that we are able to actually come up with a set of policies with which we can curb consumption, and we're able to implement these policies. Let's assume all that in the manner of economists. Since I was trained in economics, we are fond of assuming the problem away. Let's do that and see where it gets us. Let's first look at all the investment that has happened, not just in India, but around the world, to demand, in effect, this level of consumption. I'm not sure if you're with me. Are you following me or am I? Yes, no, I don't know. Hello? Please say so if you don't follow something. Um, I want to argue with you that investment creates its own consumption demand, which is to say, once a businessman or an entrepreneur or a big industrialist has sunk a large volume of capital into a certain investment, he wants a return on that investment. That's quite natural, isn't it? You would be the same, I would be the same in that situation. It's quite natural. And now imagine a situation in which he cannot sell all the product that his machines are capable of producing. In other words, he incurs the possibility of a loss or an inadequate return. Okay. Now, if we are going to have policies to curb consumption, okay, that's going to be one of the likely outcomes. Unless, as Professor Sen indicates in some parts of the paper, you conserve the overall level of demand. And then there's going to be politics over how is that demand going to be distributed across the new, sellers of the product, right? That has to be specified. How that is going to be done is not clear. So I am in perfect agreement that we are living in a condition of what, for want of a better word, one might describe as affluenza, which is a particular kind of consumer influenza, which is not good for ecology, which is not good for human beings, which is not good for human relationships and culture and so on, right? So we live in a regime of what one might call overconsumption, at least in the aggregate, and for a significant few. For the rest of the population, it may be underconsumption, but for the creamy layer, it's definitely overconsumption. One has to ask the question, what is driving them? In other words, what is driving the rich to want to go on getting richer? Is it just pure lust for lucre, or is there some more fundamental philosophical or psychic issue at work here? And I want to probe that a little bit. Let's look at a definition of globalization, which has been given by an influential banker in Europe about a generation ago. In 1995, this is Percy Barnevik, who's president of the Swiss-Swedish group ABB. And this is what he says is his definition of globalization. Quote, I would define globalization as freedom. This is not freedom in inverted commas, this is freedom, the real article. I would define globalization as freedom for my company to invest where it wants, for as long as it wants, and to produce whatever it wants, right? Armaments, drugs, pornography, anything. To produce whatever it wants by getting its supplies and selling its products wherever it wants, and by having to endure the fewest possible constraints in labor law, environmental law, collective agreements. I am not exaggerating. This is exact verbatim quote. Now, if this is your definition of freedom, and obviously the more the merrier, right? Now, as economists, we should know something about the optimum, which is to say, too much of a good thing is a bad thing. Exactly. There is an optimum, right? That's what it means to optimize using calculus and so on. Constrained optimization, all that you must have read in microeconomic theory. So it's quite obvious that too much of food beyond the limits of a healthy stomach is a bad thing. Too much of sex beyond the limits of a healthy libido is a bad thing, and many other such, right? However, it's not so obvious that too much of freedom is a bad thing. Can you have too much of freedom? Ask yourself this question seriously. Yes? No? No opinion? Say something. Okay, I'm giving you a hard time. Been a teacher too long. The point is that there is a profound distinction, in my insignificant opinion, between freedom and liberty. A point which is not understood by most of modern political theory. To explain this, let me give you a simple parable. We go to a farmer's homestead on his land, on his field. The farmer is a woman. We steal her land and lock her up in the house. The farmer has lost power. We have gained power. The farmer has lost liberty. Have we gained liberty? Maybe, some people might say. What about freedom? And I want you to reflect on it very precisely and carefully. As far as freedom is concerned, the farmer may not have lost much freedom. She still has the freedom to act, to smash the door down, whatever the hell she wants to do from inside, she can still do, and to certainly imagine what she would do when she gets out. And we, on the outside, are going to be afraid as to what might happen if and when she gets out. Israel and Palestine, right? So power is a zero-sum game. Freedom is a positive-sum game. If you have an apple and I have an apple, and I take your apple from me, I have 2 and you have 0. If you have an idea and I have an idea, and if we exchange ideas, both of us have 2 ideas. Freedom is additive, power is subtractive. Not understood by most of liberal theory, neoliberalism, economics, utilitarianism, etc. It's so simple, but it's perhaps too simple to understand, or certainly appreciate the significance of something so simple. Now, I want to plead to you that this Mr. Barnevik and thousands of others, millionaires and billionaires like him, actually have got it wrong insofar as freedom is concerned. If they are interested in freedom, they should be working towards a very different kind of world. But the truth is, they're not working for freedom, they're working for power. And we ought to call a spade by its proper name. Right? And if modern Western culture has moved from what I call enlightenment to entitlement, this is the reason. It's a fatal confusion. Why is it fatal? Because you now have to deal with the elements, not nature only. You have to deal with the elements: air, water, fire, earth, and space. You may be an atheist, but you have to deal with the elements, right? That's what this means, a fatal misunderstanding of the very idea of freedom. Since the Enlightenment, since Mr. Kant, since Hegel and Marx, and all of them are culpable here. So, I want to conclude. There's, of course, 100 more lines to say, but the reason why what Professor Sen is saying is difficult to see happen in action is because the implications will destroy the system that Dr. Das Gupta was laying out. And those who are running the system today, including, of course, the education system, which is another word for the propaganda system in place today, which is why I don't teach in university very much. The entire thing will have to go if those policies are to succeed. In other words, if you manage to succeed even 50% or even 20% in changing the values of people, which are oriented to thinking of consumption as freedom, God help the system. What are the factories going to do? What are the investors going to do? You are not living in a world of consumer sovereignty. Don't get it wrong. None of you are free. All of you are in the grip of investor sovereignty. It's a truth. Face it and face the implications of that. Are the trillions that are spent on marketing and advertising every day a waste of money? Obviously not. And all of you are addicted to this, right? You go to sleep with the thing under your pillow. It's got bacteria, by the way. It shares certain bacteria with cockroaches, so be careful. Yeah? So the smartphone is there to make you feel smart, but not be smart. It's there to condition you to a certain kind of routine screen stupidity which you engage with every hour, every moment, every minute of the day. And a smartphone is, and I'll conclude with this, more dangerous than a hydrogen bomb. It's a culturally radioactive weapon of mass destruction. It will take time for this termite to destroy the house of humanity. I won't be around possibly to watch it happen, but watch out yourselves.
Thank you. So I think we have had such fascinating points that have come, and it's an enriching discussion. We would like to indicate that Professor Chiranjib Das Gupta has a personal commitment for which she has to leave in 5 minutes, although we will continue the discussion, and Professor Anudhar is here to put his point, and then we will have a conversation and some questions from the audiences. But I thought that at this moment, if there are any questions that are there particularly directed towards Professor Chiranjib Das Gupta, we can have that for next 3-4 minutes, and then we can move to Professor Dhar. It also includes any other panelist who might have a question for Professor Das Gupta. Any questions? Panelist? Yeah, so I think Professor,
if you want to respond, you should get a chance to.
No, and I don't really have any response. See, I didn't want to get into the very large systemic questions in this paper, so that was I left it out of the discussion. I think opening up the whole broader, larger political economy of whether it is capitalism able to survive or not, it's a very different set of issues, and it will take a long time to engage in that. And I don't want to give a superficial comment on that, except I would say that many of the things that we're talking about, which we decry in the present, are things that themselves have been created. We can't pretend that they were always there. So the capitalism itself is constantly evolving, constantly changing, not becoming necessarily better, but it is changing. So what we need to understand is change is possible, and we have to also understand what systemic change is currently possible in our present context. I wouldn't want to propose or suggest mega changes which are good in principle but are not feasible at the moment. So therefore I'm saying it's a big question how capitalism will change, whether it will blow up the world or not. It's a much bigger sort of set of issues we have to discuss. But what I really want to say is that I do believe that micro level transformations can change the ideological environment in which these things survive. And there are pressures to prevent those changes from taking place, obviously. But that doesn't mean that we can't do it. And I also feel that if the undercurrent of ideology gradually changes, then society will adjust. It will create new things. I don't think that I do not deny for 1 second the present conundrum that we're in. I mean, we know the power of big business. We know the kind of capitalism that exists. But if we only consider that, I'm not saying that the other speakers are saying that, I think we'll be paralyzed. So, given these constraints, I think it's important for us to start thinking about what kind of changes can happen at the ground level, and leave the bigger question of what can be done in the future. I want to take Chiroshi's time. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, it's not really a response as such to Professor Sen. I mean, there will be zones of agreement and there will be zones of disagreement. But I think like the question that I was really trying to lay out is that the question of consumption, well, three things. The question of consumption cannot be separated from production. The second is that the consumption of the rich and the overconsumption of the rich, if you like it, or what was hedonistic consumption of the rich, and the consumption squeeze of the poor are part of a single process, and one cannot be seen in isolation from the other. And the third is that if we accept these two propositions, then even the small measures that are being suggested, can those only be concentrated, like be thought of in a paradigm where we are not considering the questions of the question of agency beyond like social marketing, if I may put it in a very cogent 3 points. Thank you.
I found the presentations fascinating. I've heard Chiranjib on this, but it was a very systematic presentation that you had. As you said, close to spiritualism, very idealistic, starting from the ground up, very Gandhian, and micro going up, individual going up, changing the world, as you now said, in response to these with limits within something. So that raises the question, if there are those limits and the macro system is such as it is, how quickly do you run into limits? What are your agencies anyway in that case? But I just wanted to insert one little element of history into it. And I was fascinated by both your presentations. I thought they were wonderful. You see, if we take the extreme inequality, we've had in history eras where inequality has been completely in the Gilded Age. And it has come down. If you take the US, it came down, right down into the Roosevelt years, and then it began to go up. Yes, so if you take the case of, I completely agree on the universalization of social, socioeconomic security through all these provisions and so on, and free at the point of provision. That was the motto which emerged from the National Health Service formation, and of course the education policy, which was also there in 1944. But it happened in the context of the UK coming out of the war. You see, where there was a tremendous class background of war. And in the US, it was to do with the Depression. And so you see, you get historical phenomena in which these major alternatives come up, not in a revolutionary sense, although it looked revolutionary, say in the UK, like the New Deal and so on. You get those. So it doesn't have to be a total systemic change, but it has to be framed historically. If you take the case, now a positive case in Europe, say between post-war, and that's the period right down to 1973 when the oil price hike took place. They call it the golden age of capitalism in European act, because there was low inflation, low unemployment, and a modest and high rate of growth. So they were saying, how is that possible? Because there was an incomes policy and there was a social cooperatism where you had productivity gains, but they were shared very much more equally with the working class. So if you take these sort of options, but what do we have now? We have a situation where what is Zuckerberg or whatever, and everybody else wants to provide universal basic income. And you begin to wonder why. You see, it's the other way around. It's to try and stabilize a system of extreme inequality. It's gone the other way. And I think all the schemes that we have for providing this, and all these different kind of a thing, the rate, social budget overall is very high. It's not just education, but the thing that goes through is very high in these. And that is because everything can be handed out as the prime minister's this and so's that. And that allows them, that gives them the material, social material, to actually get re-elected and keep the system of inequality going. So I think we are living in a very perverse situation at this time, waiting for some historical moment, like the others, which will bring about a social framework where there can be a lot of social agency. So I think that, Chiranjib, it's a bit far away from what you are suggesting, but I think that unless we have that type of an environment, I don't see a prospect where I think the limits which have been pointed out by both of you are too close. And so, so I think there is a side of history which I wanted to bring into this. Both sides, positive and negative.
I'm really sorry I have to leave. It's a responsibility which capitalism imposes on women, which is elderly care. So I really regret not being able to stay to the end. All best wishes, public policy program. Thank you.
I think what Professor Seth has just said is very important. I just want to qualify the qualification you made by reminding ourselves that between 1945 and 1973, the so-called 71 to be more precise, the so-called Golden Age, is also the time that Western nations have just discovered military Keynesianism, and the longest peacetime expansion happened during the Vietnam War, 106 months. US and UK. And that can't be left out of the equation here for the reason that in terms of maintaining levels of aggregate demand at close to full employment and having a successful incomes policy, you need to have that level of demand in order to be able to push through something like a welfare state before Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan have the opportunity to take it all down. My point is that developing countries, whether it's India or China, don't have those imperial luxuries without straining their budgets and without straining their resource constraints domestically.
So we'll now go to Professor Dhar, and he's going to primarily bring in the psychoanalytic dimension, because we have had discussions on consumption and value changes. So his points also will indicate on that. Yeah, over to you.
I didn't know I was supposed to do that. Professor Sen's paper takes us to the threshold of what we designate as Dharma Sankat. Dharma in the Indian tradition is not religion, it is an ethical dilemma or an ethical conflict. Conflict and contradiction is at the heart of the understanding of Dharma, of ethics. The Dharma Sankat between consumption and sustainability. The Dharma Sankat between consumption and happiness or well-being, between need and greed, between need and desire, between desire and fantasy, between lack and surplus, between surplus labor and surplus pleasure, between use value and fetishism. This was too telegraphic. I'll spell it out actually as I go along. But I thought Professor Sen actually, and he did preface the problem actually, that he is going to look at consumption which has not been looked at with so much intensity, and he is going to open up the black box of consumption. So he was not, I think, unaware of the relationship between production and sustainability. He wanted to foreground that major discussion on sustainability happens from the production pole. Can it happen also from the consumption pole? If you bring the consumption pole, the human being comes in, human choice, freedom, autonomy, desire, etc., comes in. And if that comes in, this has to be kept far actually. If that comes in, then the question of happiness, well-being, and hence the question of the psychological comes in, and that's why I'm here so much. Arindam's question quickly. It is also a dharma sankat between policy from above and policy from below. The bird's eye view or the earthworm's view. Policy on the people or policy of the people, policy with the public, especially, as Shirashri was pointing out, the quote unquote, the poor public. Policy in practice. So host of things around policy, but these are dharma sankats actually. If it's all been resolved, if it's all known, then there is nothing to discuss. If there is something unknown, then there is something to discuss. In this context, let me come to the main discussion. For Vygotsky, the Russian psychologist, psychology is in need of its own capital, the book. What does Vygotsky mean by this statement? Does he want to say that psychology needs to have an investigation and a text analogous to Marx's Capital? Does he mean to say psychology needs to work on a concept comparable to the power of the concept class? However, if psychology is in need of its capital, Marxism is also in need of its own interpretation of dreams. Thus, the respective theorizations of Marx and Freud cannot be put to a relation without turning the tables on both, without each moving into territories hitherto forbidden. I saw Professor Sen's paper as an attempt to enter territories that have been hitherto rendered forbidden, actually. The economist will not talk to psychology, the psychologist will not talk to political economy. So I saw a power in your paper in terms of the need to move into territories hitherto forbidden, and that is the problem with both Marx and Freud. Or do they manage to move into territories hitherto forbidden? So that is problem one actually. If psychology is in need of capital, capital is in need of interpretation of dreams. And why is it in need? Why each is in need of the other is one area that can be opened up. And I will focus on only one line from Capital Volume 1, footnote 1 of Capital Volume 1, just that one footnote actually. Marx left behind, or did not leave behind, the question of the psychic in the first footnote of Capital. This footnote, missed by orthodox Marxism thereafter, globally, has left a big black hole in our efforts at understanding economy, as also moving towards just political economies, what Professor Sen was trying to reach, etc. Marx began Capital with the following: the wealth of those societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails presents itself as an immense accumulation of commodities, its unit being a single commodity. Our investigation must therefore begin with the analysis of a commodity. So commodity and consumerism, Professor Sen, we needed to look into. We have to. A commodity is an object outside us, a thing that by its properties satisfied human wants of some sort or another. Now comes the line. The nature of such wants, whether for instance they spring from the stomach or from fantasy, makes no difference. Neither are we here concerned to know how the object satisfies these wants, whether directly as a means of subsistence or indirectly as means of satisfaction. Marx thus puts aside, this is the first footnote of Capital, Marx thus puts aside actually the question of wants and of fancy or fantasy, the question of needs, not so much needs, but the question of desire. This question has come to haunt us finally, actually, that how will we now connect consumption and sustainability, commodities and sustainability, and do we need a hyphen called wants, fancy, desire, fantasy to make sense of that? So I'm making the problem more acute actually by saying there is a more problem when we think of consumption. Sustainability is only one side of the problem. The other side of the Dharma Sankat is us. What in us? Quickly put, not much time actually. What if one needed to look at what, again I quote Marx, desire implies want. It is the appetite of the mind and is as natural as hunger to the body. The greatest number of things have their value from supplying the wants of the mind. So this want, this desire, this space, how do we bring into our understanding of consumption or of commodities, which is what I thought your paper was trying to maybe quote unquote unsuccessfully deal with. The power is not in the success, the power is in the question. This takes me to 3 telegraphic points actually, which I can't develop. Problem 1, the commodity is not a commodity. The commodity in a realist sense is a watch. But the commodity in a fetishistic sense is much more than the real concrete watch. Marx calls it concrete real, the concrete real watch. And this is the power of fetishism. I was pleasantly surprised to see Marx spend a major amount of time before writing Capital, before writing the Grundrisse, on studying religion and anthropology. And he studied largely the anthropology of religion and the role of fetishism in religion. What is fetishism? Making more out of something limited. Okay. Commodity or consumerism has this problem inside it, actually. Consumerism works or doesn't work or whatever because it is not actually about the commodity. It is actually about something more than the commodity, the concrete real commodity or the concrete use value of the commodity. I buy this pen not because it writes. I buy this pen because it is Parker pen. So in that sense, that hedonistic element that you bring out over there, Marx starts his discussion of commodity fetishism by talking about a normal wooden table, which is an ordinary sensuous thing, but as soon as it emerges as a commodity, it changes into a thing which transcends the limits of sensuousness. It's more than our sensuousness, actually. Marx uses this story of the table to show how a simple, ordinary thing is turned into something quite different, almost alien, once it enters the capitalist market. So something happens over here, and this moment is very, very important in the consumption question. The smartphone, Asim, actually, it has now taken a fetishistic power and a quality, a monstrous fetishistic quality, far beyond our limited human smartness. All the way, all. This also opens up an important question to which I will come at the end, and it connects to Professor Sen's argument, I think, is that the cunning of capitalism is also in converting relationships between human beings into relationships between things. And in that sense, the turn to the eudaimonic, I felt, was a turn to the relationship between human beings rather than the relationship between things. Psychoanalysis, in one line, today's definition, is a relationship between human beings. Last, Somajit. So there is over here in Marx a fundamental question, and he uses this term, it's not my term, substitution. Substitution of a relationship between human beings with a substitution of a relationship between things. And that's the hedonic. The other cunning of capitalism is actually not, if Asim took up the question of freedom, let me take up the question of enjoyment. The fundamental imperative of capitalism is enjoy. And this is something that the commodity question can open up. The question is not just perhaps of surplus value or surplus labor. The question is also of surplus pleasure. An elusive surplus pleasure that has to be pursued like a mirage. So the turntable that one requires over here, and it was actually Lacan, the French psychoanalyst, he was actually delivering his seminar. He was putting his hands on a table and he said, Marx looked at surplus value, missed the dimension of surplus pleasure. So if Marx had turned the table on, on Mill Bentham and Smith Ricardo, Lacan again turned the table on Marx, but he's not anti-Marx. He's trying to build on Marx, actually, to say the role of surplus pleasure in life, and how capitalism produces that imperative to pleasure, enjoy. Mere dil mange more. So in that sense, the one-liner over here is that the consumption question, while in the sphere of production, in the secret abode of production, which is Marx's line, we have foregrounded the question of alienation and exploitation to fundamental insights that have changed human thinking forever. In the sphere of consumption, do we also need to bring in while alienation and exploitation were the dimensions there, do we also need to bring in the question of surplus pleasure, surplus enjoyment, and how it interpolates us into consumption. So there the sustainability question faces a further crisis, a further dharma sankat actually, because we are not driven by our needs but by our greeds, and these greeds could far surplus us in terms of our fantasy. In that sense, I think I can end here, Somajit. The quick point is this, yeah, a one-liner, that unexpected help, I'll call it, can come to Marxism from psychoanalysis. And what is my proof of it? Fetishism was invoked by Marx in Capital Volume 1. The theorization was completed by Freud on fetishism, Freud's paper. Okay, I have many such examples, but let us end with this.
I think has been such a fascinating discussion, and so many points are just like mentioned as if like just side point, but they need lot more discussions and deliberation. Maybe we can have part 2 of such conversation. Let's see, we will think about it. But I can see Asim has some response to what. Okay. Okay, but I thought that maybe we can use 5 minutes, because if there are panelists who have response to each other, otherwise we can open for questions. I know we are supposed to end at 5:30. Maybe we'll take 10 more minutes extra because we started slightly late. So if anybody has questions to each other, that will be the ideal. I have questions. I'll part for later.
I don't have any questions. I just wanted to say how wonderful it is to have a psychology and a economics, political economy having a platform to talk together, raising issues on which they both have something to say, but in a totally different way. The only one thing that struck me when you went in this direction of surplus pleasure, etc., that surplus pleasure which is vaguely related with eudaimonic, but actually, I was thinking of Vedantic concept of what gives human liberation, what gives human pleasure, what is the so-called surplus pleasure, what is Vivekananda talking about, what is Ramakrishna talking about? They're talking about that. Nobody can openly say it in a Marxist context, but effectively what is being said is exactly that. If we could somehow, as human beings, which have the capacity to do, but very difficult to do, really go for this, try to develop the human spiritual side, which we haven't really done. In fact, capitalism has blocked that. Then we could actually make a different world, new world. That's all I would say. And that's why I found your thing so fascinating.
I wouldn't change too much of what I said, but I will. Sorry. Can you not hear me? Yeah. I wouldn't change too much of what I said, but I would very humbly amend and qualify some of it. And perhaps the best way to do it is to enter this new terrain of discussion which Anup has just opened up, by reminding ourselves that Marx uses the concept of the whale of the market, or the whale of money. And one of his great insights is that the whale of money, or the market, or the realm of exchange, wherein rule freedom and Bentham, if I recall the passage right in Capital Volume 1, that conceals the ensemble of social relations, of relations between humans, and the conversion of a relation between subjects into a relationship between objects. In like manner, and here I'm really going out on a limb by sharing with you in advance of my book's publication one of the key ideas in the book. Could it be that the veil of the market, or the veil of money, is as equally concealing the relationship of subjectivities between the human and the non-human natural world? Yes. In other words, when Martin Buber talks about looking at a tree and the identification he experiences with the tree, or that Ramchandra Gandhi, if some of you know the story, Mahatma Gandhi's grandson, he resigned his job at University of Hyderabad because the university authorities brought down an old banyan on campus. He resigned his job. He was that wounded by the act of the cutting of the banyan, which was hundreds of years old. So what happens when you have a culture like ours, which has worshipped trees, which ties Rakhis on trees? I haven't seen it anywhere in Europe or United States, but I have seen it in India. Everywhere you'll find it within half a kilometer of here, at least 100 trees with that sort of thing. Why is that supposed to be superstition according to some materialistic culture? Why should we accept that ascription? Why can't we defend ourselves spiritually by saying, you guys are just not civilized enough to notice that there is something terribly human and terribly natural about this bond which I experience with this tree, much like you folks experience with your pets, which you tie a collar around and put a name and a number to, and so on. So the veil of the market and the veil of money might actually be concealing the vast bulk of the natural and cosmic worlds from us. And I'm reminded of Hegel's line, I can't remember, in one of those phenomenologies, where he talks about how nature, in the manner of European Romanticism, that nature, if I might be paraphrasing, nature is man looking at himself, and man
of, I don't know what to call it, okay, creative power, but is there no creativity in the body? It's not a good way to look at it. Is there no creativity in thinking, cognition? Okay, somatic power, labor power, cognitive power, and aesthetic power. If these are three human dimensions, I'm deliberately saying labor power, cognitive power, and aesthetic power. How do you understand consumption there? Would be a complex question, actually, very complex question.
No, actually, if you, sorry, I have a comment on this. As you just occurred to me, you see, it's a very interesting issue. Art is, and aesthetics is actually an independent spiritual creative activity. Normally, that's what it should be. And so it is, in my opinion, something beyond economics in its essence. But if you look at the way art is being valued, when you put a value in it, in a number in which the Van Gogh, he didn't sell a single painting in his lifetime. But today one piece is worth millions. So therefore here is an example of where you're putting a value which is totally devoid of the what is might be called the essence of the object. So in a way I would say that having art and aesthetics is a wonderful outlet for human activity, but as an economic activity in this whole realm of what we're discussing, in my opinion, it seems to me it's very, very irrational.
What is my question? My suspicion, so if I was to look at public policy and public choices, I felt like art, or when I say art, I'm not talking about a painting or anything, it could be architecture, it could be just design of lifestyle or fabric of anything. It can precipitate in us ideation, options. Very simple. I see somebody wearing khadi that looks nice, I might choose to buy it myself. And that's the kind of thing I'm talking about, which is unsaid, untheorized. And it's art because people who have to conceive these things and put them to action have to be actually very creative to be able to do that and to have influence in the reduction of consumption in some way.
You remind me of a very famous, but one of my old teachers actually, Professor Sitovsky. He wrote a very interesting book called The Joyless Economy. And in that, he specifically talks about the need for developing consumption skills. We become bored with mass consumption, partly because we opt for comfort. But he makes the argument that we actually need to develop consumption skills to develop appreciation for the creativity in the object, interacting with between the producer and the consumer. And some of the things you mentioned follow very much into this thing of a different way of consuming, where you actually consume mindfully, you consume creatively, and for that you need some skill. This knowledge doesn't come automatically. You have to train people to be able to consume. So I think that's a very, very good point. Yeah, it needs to. It's an important point that Sitovsky made in that book.
There's two things which I want to say to this. One is the immediate response to what Professor Sen just says. Skitovsky's book, The Joyless Economy, which we also read a little bit of in Delhi School of Economics 40 years ago, is, if I may say so, also very Eurocentric. Because if you look at our mandis and hearts and bazaars, they are anything but joyless. And the kind of bargaining that goes on is actually full of fun and games and pleasure. It's a sport in itself. It's a skill in itself. You see it on Janpat, you see it in some of the shops in Delhi Haat, but residues of a culture which has gone by. The other thing is that if you look at the visual consumer landscape today, I don't think anyone is innocent of this anymore. And I don't just mean the sexualization of cognition and all the other things that have been talked about, but much subtler things than even the sexualization. In other words, when something like ICICI is advertising driving home a relationship, no, I mean, jokes apart, but there is a lot of thought given to things there. Jo tera hai, jo mera hai, so tera hai, jo tera hai, so mera hai, that sort of thing. All this is the appropriation of emotions and the aestheticization of the consumer experience, which has to be taken extremely seriously in terms of its semiotics, in terms of its economic value, and so on. There's a lot more to say.
Yeah, I think a few resonances to what was said. I would say that I think you mentioned commodity fetishism, Anup, but that runs all the way through in Marx as well, right the way through. And I think I found it fascinating that you made the leap in a way to the conversation with Freud. And I think, but Marx is very clear. You said the veil and so on, but commodity fetishism is a very new thing at that point in time. And so that's one thing I wanted to mention. A few other, they're just little resonances, but they're widening out your thing. The utilitarians did not associate themselves, the founders of, as you would know, they didn't associate it directly with hedonism. I mean, they are called hedonists, but the original utilitarian stuff was really looking at the way you lived, the institutional arrangements within which life was actually conducted. So it is the economists who came along then who actually converted it, the mainstream economists, into okay, utility is equal to consumption. That equation came from the economists, didn't come from the utility, although I think there are the other problems, so I think it's closer to the kind of thing you're talking about, that original idea of utilitarianism in that way. Now, the idea of commodity fetishism is very much, and the rejection of this, and bringing in the psychological element is very much there in Keynesian economics in England. It's in England. For instance, I mean, Joan Robinson said, a fur coat is a fur coat is a fur coat, and no nonsense. A car is a car is a car. Don't talk nonsense about this model, that model. This is what it is. So she's making a clear separation there. And you're talking about joyless economy, but to Melissi, there was this chap, Mishan, who did the cost of economic growth, which is actually the whole book is about, the choices which are being foisted upon people. You go into a supermarket, there are 80 different kinds of shirts. and he wants a shirt. I mean, this is where Joan Robinson's things come in. Shirt is a shirt is a shirt. So I think this whole idea is very much part of that kind of thinking, but not in the US side of the other side of the thing, because there it becomes very much the kind of the way that we are describing it. Now this brings me to a question about this. You mentioned something about Keynesianism earlier, Asim, and I think that the big difference between Keynesianism as it was interpreted in the US, what Joan called bastard Keynesianism, and Keynesianism in the UK. Keynesianism in the UK was always thought to be social Keynesianism. And the way that actually demand was meant to be kept going was through social consumption. That was the essence of it, social consumption. And on the other side was militarization. In fact, her ED lecture, when she went there, Galbraith called it, was a full blast against militarization and against Vietnam. So I think we have to keep those two separate, because the kinds of paradigms that you're trying to raise, Chiranjib, and they actually become validated to some extent in that kind of a branch of thinking behind economics. It's not, so that's the one thing I want to say. But actually, what you're saying, I didn't hear the word degrowth in any other discussion. Yeah, but the point is that, you know, it's a huge literature, and it has started that concept not from the economists. It started from sociologists, from psychologists, and so on elsewhere. Economists have been very late coming in. I mean, Juan Martinez Allier has come in very late from ecology into this. Owen Daly, I wouldn't put him quite as a degrowth person. I mean, it's a critique of growth, but not a degrowth. But I think that idea of degrowth, and if you can say, oh, what will happen to consumption? I mean, that was your critique in a way. You know, if you take consumption away, the model will collapse. But what if you bring in some version of a social Keynesianism which actually keeps the demand up, but not through this useless consumption, but through sort of social forms of consumption? And I think that's the kind of a thing which that is an element which I found, worth discussing.
My question might crisscross with him too much, so maybe we should first.
There's just one small thing I want to say. I completely agree with you, and I think it's very important to distinguish between shades of Keynesianism because it's too broad, and the experience of the two sides of the Atlantic are quite different in the post-war period. What Thatcher unravels in Britain is far greater in some ways than what Reagan unravels in the US. He also unravels something, but I think the damage that Thatcher does is much greater than what Reagan does. And it's not Reagan, but Thatcher who says there is no such thing as society and wins 3 elections on that slogan, even today with society having broken down. And that brings me to the point about social consumption, and to do justice to your paper, I think that is what we have to focus on, because it's against a category which has to be unpacked. For instance, a certain kind of corporate thinking in India today, and Rishi will bear me out probably, has to do with thinking socially from a corporate perspective, not just corporate social responsibility, but corporations having the responsibility of noblesse oblige, given that we have been a feudal culture and continue to be in so many ways. Single patron universities, case in point, you know. I think that social consumption also should be unpacked for another reason, which is that there's a vast amount of social consumption which is being prompted, not just prompted, it's being led and pushed aggressively by politicians. And the reason for that is not vote banking as much as note banking. There's only 2 things which politicians do, right? So when they want to make money in the cycle of their sort of electoral process, wherein they are gathering money for the next election, is when they want the big projects. So an expressway, a 12-lane expressway between 2 villages. I know, and that's why I'm saying one has to distinguish, because in India, if you look at the developer's view of development, you and Amartya Sen and many others would have absolutely nothing in common with that, right? But that is the model of development in place today across the country and for the last 20 years at least. So if one does not unpack the social consumption, one by default will be led to support things you can't possibly defend.
On a different note, actually, what happens when a concept travels to the United States, crosses the Atlantic? One could actually call it the McDonaldization of the concept, actually. So they actually tend to receive, or the Donaldization of a concept. So they would Donaldization, okay. So the concept would be made into a combo, actually. Burger, some paneer in the middle, and French fries and Coke. So yes, freedom fries. So that problem is there. So I just remain equally troubled by how concepts travel to the United States and they come back to us as burgers.
I was hoping to hear from you also Marx's paragraphs on what a communist society would have as a moral code of what would be.
Yeah.
And its freedoms. So I
Yes.
wondered if you wanted to use that also as a concept.
Also, yes. Sure.
I think the way I heard Professor Sen's paper being evolved by the other two speakers, or the three speakers, and to be brought to the plane of Dharm Sankat towards the end, and which is where the boom happened. You know, there was a boom in our minds, of course augmented by Anoop's voice and Anoop's assertions on certain terms by which psychology stands to come into a kind of a good dialogue with economics. So that was a point where the words presents itself, as Anoop was reading the footnote, emerged in my mind as something that has its own ambiguity. What presents itself in fetish? But the act of something unspecified presenting itself is where the question that I hear Asim point, which is that, is there a necessary pleasure? That if you're talking about the surplus pleasure, is there a necessary pleasure? How is that necessary pleasure conceived in post-Freudian terms? If psychoanalysis is a domain of human relationships in which we must create a space that at the point that I feel excited, such as we should wonder, you know, we are giving students a lot. Is there a surplus that we are giving them? Where has the optimum gone there? You know, in a 2 hours or 2.5 hours of panel, we are possibly making them into consumers, no different from the ones that we are saying exercise, they should exercise some self-discipline. You know, so that's the excitement of emotion that psychoanalysis alerts us to, hoping that some lyrical process will emerge out of this. Something lyrical will emerge, something like, I thought, only capitalist sitting on his, and also a thinker is saying, what about art and aesthetics? Just 2 words. You know, where is that born? Is that born in a necessary pleasure, producing a parallel by which so many of the examples of Asim about our country get sort of illuminated? You know, it's as if we are trying to bring into the baby who has the surplus pleasure. But the surplus pleasure in psychoanalysis is producing, cultivating a domain of the maternal reverie, where the mother becomes both the source of the fetish and the source of the thing in itself. A Freudian idiom of. And for us to connect with the thing in itself, I think we should watch a film that has just been brought on Mubi called The Substance, where a struggle is shown between an older 50-year-old woman, a physical trainer, who is fired because she's losing the body contours and the energy, for us to draw the audience. So she's to be replaced by someone younger, and she takes a substance to produce a younger, much like Parvati produced Ganesha out of her own body. So here is a substance by which a younger part is produced in her. But just as she's doing it, there is a plaque is being produced on the floor, is being tiled onto the floor, and this plaque has an importance as thing in itself, because in all our talk of consumption, we haven't brought in the death. Whereas Freud and Marx both have a preoccupation with death. And I think thing in itself is our tribute to the mother, that the capitalist imagination should also be accredited. And when I say mother, it is the maternal function, which also keeps the fathering process in itself. So it's not just the mother. A mother who can have a reverie about the baby's needs and thereby produce the concept of needs, not just fantasy and greed. So I think the father-mother combined is where we have a new notion coming up post-Freud and in Sudhir Kakar's works. And I just wanted to bring that in, that the movement of the capitalist imagination towards producing the image of the aesthetic, which closer to what you said, which is the experiencing of the experience, where all consumption, so you can have a Van Gogh not needing to sell the paintings, because for him that is a complete experience. Something very close to the stillness that over here we talk about. So I think some of these notions are useful for us to promote the dialogue, and most importantly for Ashwini's need to produce a possible historical first in our own imagination.
I think you've raised a very important point, and it opens up the horizon for a whole long evening of discussion. The reason why I mentioned necessary pleasure is actually because I do distinguish quite sharply in the English language between joy is a condition of completeness and plenitude, in the manner of the invocation to the Ishavasya, Purnamida Purnamidam, that, So there's a completeness, there's a wholeness, the infinite is available to you. You're not alienated from the infinite that inhabits you and that you inhabit, right? In that state of mind, the last thing you're going to think of is a supermarket or a mall or an airport lounge or a red light district. You are not going to think of consumption in that state of mind. It's that state of fullness, that state of plenitude, which the mother experiences in the presence of the baby and the baby experiences in the presence of the mother. The root of all eroticism is right there, right? So I think that one needs to keep that sacred core to all these discussions. Without that, we will get lost. This is my fear. And intellectually, we'll be seduced into all sorts of thoughts which are not valid, in my humble opinion. So I think that the way to actually think this through in a very simple way to completion is to think of time. Time dies. In that moment of complete life experience, there is no time. And that timelessness is exactly what human beings, or indeed any creature living, is actually after. But it eludes us because we don't have any faith in the eternal anymore. But if one realizes or remembers the vision of eternity, available to everybody, I think we'll be through. And then subspecie aeterni, the way we would think philosophically and conceptually in an economical way, be very different. And you'll only do as much thinking as is needed to live, and not enough to get you your next paper in a journal. So this kind of intellectual corruption that has happened with the professionalization of knowledge will stop. There's a story about Theodor Shanin, the Marxist sociologist, walking through Central Asia somewhere doing his field study, later anti-Marxist. And he says he goes to a village and there's a peasant and who's sitting on his own anymore, or cannot sit sometimes. And he says to the peasant, sitting and thinking, eh? And he says, no, just sitting.
Since the mood is right, the distinction between hedonic and eudaimonic, and what Asim just now did between pleasure and joy, it may be interesting actually to look at Tagore, who painstakingly distinguishes between Sukha and Ananda, and goes to Buddhism actually to track the itinerary of Ananda in thought. Just now is the distinction between the Simit and the Asimit. Bad Hindi, Shima or Oshim actually, infinite, but that relationship, I think, could be a way to look at, perhaps.
Thank you, all the panelists, for such a provoking discussion. And as I told, I firmly believe that 2.0 is necessary. We will definitely plan on that. But one thing that maybe one of the sources of necessary pleasure stems from your physiology. So maybe that's the reason we have our high tea waiting. So some of us would like to kind of have that necessary pleasure. So on that note, let us end, and I hand it over to Vaishali.
Thank you to our wonderful panelists for an insightful discussion. The issues we've explored today around consumption. Ashwini Seth, could you please come over to give a token of appreciation to our panelists? Thank you. Thank you, Professor Seth. I would invite Dr. Pranav Srigunayat to deliver the vote of thanks, and we all head for the high tea. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you for a very thought-provoking discussion. On behalf of the School of Liberal Studies at BML Munjal University, we extend our deepest gratitude to our esteemed panelists, Professor Chiranjib Sen, Professor Asim Srivastav, Professor Shray Das Gupta, and Professor Anudhar, for sharing their invaluable insights on the complex intersections of consumption, public policy, and sustainability. Your perspectives have enriched our understanding of these pressing issues and inspired us to think critically about public policy's role in shaping a more equitable and sustainable future. We are truly fortunate to have such a distinguished voices guiding us in rethinking the policy frameworks that shape our society. A special thanks to Professor Arindam Banerjee, who's not here, our Dean, for initiating the discussion on public policy series and framing today's session with thought-provoking questions. We also extend our heartfelt appreciation to Dr. Shomajit Bhar for skillfully moderating the discussion and guiding us through the nuances of consumerism's role in policy. We would also like to extend our sincere thanks to Professor Ashwini Seth, Dean Emeritus, for anchoring the discussion paper series and the faculty and research colloquium. His support and commitment to fostering an academic community that engages deeply with these critical issues is greatly appreciated. Our sincere thanks also go to Professor Shyam Menon, who's our Vice Chancellor, for his constant encouragement and support, which make these conversations possible. A special mention and thanks to Meghna Sharma from the Dean's Office for a seamless coordination, and to all our colleagues and faculty members whose dedication contributed to the success of today's event. Needless to say, this event would not have been possible without the invaluable assistance of the BMU communications, the IT, the administration, and the finance team. Lastly, a very warm thank you to all our guests, both in person and who joined online, for your presence and engagement. I would now request all of you to please join us for high tea, and we look forward to welcoming you to the future sessions in the public policy series. So thank you, and I hope you all have a very wonderful evening. And the student volunteers also, who put up a very good show tonight. Thank you so much. Thank you for all the help.